Everyone, I welcome you. Hello, everyone. I welcome you all to the debate today. The motion for today is this House prefers a world without coalition politics. For this, I would like to invite the proposition first speaker to take the stage. Please, PM.
Yeah, I'll just take 10 seconds to set up my timer and then we'll start. All right, starting in 3, 2, 1. For the motion, this has proposes a world without coalition politics. We think that it being a comparative motion, the burden on both the sides would be to prove that why in a scenario a government with a full majority is much more better than a government which is actually established based upon relations between two political parties, irrespective of their own political ideologies or irrespective of the amount of interest that they have in each other's political position. That is to say that it is an arrangement of convenience. Why then do we think that it is actually harmful? We'll be presenting that in our two main arguments. First being that how the promotion and the formation of a government then is just for the sake of it, but how it also delegitimizes the unique interests that might be for people. But second argument being about the people's wish at large and the ineffective governance that is caused by coalition governments. But first of all, over to the characterization. Why does coalition politics happens in the very first place? Two key reasons for this. There's a lack of singular majority of a political party, and thus to seek that particular majority just to dominate in this legislative assembly, it is highly likely that political parties might want such arrangement to be made. But secondly, that they want better results in elections at large. They just want to have a bigger footprint and not to have that much of an efficient opposition in, let's say, voting over a particular bill or act in the future. This might look like BJP trying to establish relations with a regional party in Haryana just to ensure that they have a dominance in the Haryani legislative assembly. Second, over to the fact that why are they likely to use such an arrangement and not any other alternative? Two key reasons for this. First, being the national parties would want to do this to establish much more dominance in regional states. This might
POI.
look like people in NDA trying to establish regional connections in the northeastern parties just to ensure that they're able to capitalize over their footprint. Understand that how this is actually represented in the fact that they do not consider the amount of ideology or the amount or the political manifesto of these northeastern parties, but rather about the fact that they have just a footprint present over there, which leads to again problems such as BJP not able to understand what exactly tribals want or what exactly tribals need right now. So this might look like
POI.
them actually not being able to understand what exactly is the issue in the very first place, but also not being able to connect with this alliance also in order to drive out what is important. But secondly, that regional parties might want to do this with regional parties to combat national parties in the very first place. But understanding that various regional parties are made for unique interests, for establishing unique policies for certain communities, we think that it is highly likely that these such unique ideologies are going to be diminished on side opposition, just
POI.
because there's not going to be much interaction between the two, something that we're going to establish in our first argument further. But thirdly, we think that the circumstances again an arrangement of convenience. Two key reasons why this is an arrangement of convenience, because a, it is not a coalition based upon, let's say, political interest together. We think that in the moment that it is made upon, let's say, similar political interest between two people, then that would not exactly be an alliance, rather than just a force coming together and just an election and just not a coalition government, but rather than an alliance based upon furthering political relations. We think that a coalition then differs from this for two key reasons. First is that coalition based upon the fact that these two parties would be running against each other, and later on they might come together just to amalgamate the votes that they got. But secondly, the fact that they are not based upon the political ideologies that individuals have, and even if they are, they're not exactly coherent to one another, and they're not exactly trying to amalgamate a policy framework combining the two
POI.
ideologies. This slide looked like an NDA tried to push forward as an alliance a combined manifesto, but let's say NDA and the Akali Dal not pushing forward a combined manifesto. This might look like then differing political ideologies and not a comprehensive plan. Before I move ahead, the POI.
What is the likely counterfactual on your side when a political party doesn't receive enough votes to win a majority?
We think that the likely counterfactor in this scenario then would be that the party that got the most votes would still be the government of the particular country, but the rest of the parties would act as the opposition. This might then look like that to pass any particular legislation, the opposition parties are actually trying to interact with the government, and they have an incentive to actually push forward for better legislation at any point of time. Note that this then proves that there is enough amount of effective, even if less, but effective governance on our side, just because of the heightened role of the opposition and the amount of discourse and the amount of legitimization of other communities that are coming in to happen, something that would again be pressed upon in our first argument. Coming over to our first argument then, that with what promotes the formation of a government. We already told you in a characterization that coalition parties are based upon, coalition governments are based upon the principle of pushing forward a majority of winning an election rather than upon the comprehensive planning of what the people want. This might then look like a lack of planning as to what exactly what exactly the manifesto would look like, what would the government machinery do, and what exactly is the combined rule. This might then look like these parties, the government in itself, not having a coordination factor in it, which is problematic for two key reasons. First is that if the government doesn't have coordination in itself about what exactly do they need to do, then effective governance is pushed out of question, because then they're not able to gain a majority in themselves, but also that they're not able to implement anything properly because of the lack of coordination between different factors. This might look like the Ministry of Health not coordinating with the Ministry of Education, leading to further issues. But secondly, we think that this is also delegitimizes unique interest, something that the POI also clearly answers, right? That how does it delegitimize unique interest? For a regional party to actually come forward with a national party, they have to somewhere along the lines push down their own political ideology. This might then look like them only being there for the name of the party, but rather than actually just joining this extra main dominant party in this scenario. Then this might then actually delegitimize the unique arguments that made them the MP or the MLA of that particular constituency, but rather than being just individuals that got voted for, which is also deceiving to the voter, because now the very ideology that they voted for is not being represented in the legislative assembly. Because as a voter, we think that it is important for the ideologies that we vote for to be represented at one point or the other in a legislative debate, which means that the moment that these political parties actually start amalgamating with one another in a scenario that is actually only for vote gaining, and to even cause any sign of coordination, they would have to subordinate their own ideologies, which is again problematic. But why then do we solve this in our side of the house, right? That why do we, through our model, ensure that this amount of delegitimization does not happen? Because political parties still have an incentive to speak for themselves, because they still want to gain the majority, right? So they think that the reason that we got voted for, we just need to further it. But secondly, that it also just wrapping up with this last reason, and secondly, it also ensures that the people that they're voting, that the people that they're trying to appreciate, the people that they're trying to bring into the discourse always are there. But also thirdly, it heightens the role of regional parties and the national parties regional parties and the people's choice at large, something that our second speaker would be furthering upon. Very, very proud to propose. Thank you.
With this, I would like to invite the second speaker. Please have the stage.
May I get 15 seconds just to prepare for the budget?
Of course.
Okay, I'm ready. I'm just mentioning this before. I'll be taking my POIs in chat. I'll be beginning at the count of 3, 2, 1. Hello, everybody. I'm Navya Agarwal, the leader of opposition, who strongly believes in the merit of a coalition government. In my speech, I will be covering the following. 1, the characterization, which includes, first of all, what a coalition government is, characteristics of it. 2, stakeholder analysis. 2, stakeholder analysis, and 3, establishment of status quo. I will also be covering 2 constructives. One will be about the greater checks and balances in a coalition government, and 2 about the upholding of democracy. I will also be giving a few rebuttals at the end. My second speaker will be dealing with 1 constructive about regional parties development, along with rebuttals and clash analysis. Moving on to my characterization. Coalition government is basically the type of government that is formed when 2 or more political parties temporarily start working together in order to achieve a common goal. This is usually formed when a party doesn't get majority votes in a democratic voting, and so works with other parties in order to achieve more votes. And obviously, the end goal of any political party is to win the voting, and so that they can be a part of the government and make decisions for the betterment of the citizens. One very important thing that needs to be noted is that both parties in a coalition government are equal, and both ideologies, they both usually have separate ideologies, which are both considered while making decisions for the betterment of the country. This form of government benefits both stakeholders, 1, the political parties, and 2, the citizens themselves as well. It benefits the political parties because 1, the discussion of ideas that occurs between the 2 parties, it leads to better feasibility plans. So once an idea is suggested or proposed in this form of government, there are different perspectives that are brought into, so that the plan further gets improved, and there are no loopholes that can be made for this. And this helps citizens also benefit because the plan is better established. Feasibility plans are also much better, and it's pitched better to the citizens as well, so that they are able to understand what the law means. This benefits citizens as well, because all of these better plans, these are designed to benefit the citizens as well, right? It's designed to it's designed for the betterment of the living conditions of a citizen. So now, if the ideologies are considered, the idea that's proposed just increases, it grows. You're better able to establish the idea, and hence its citizens are better able to live with the laws that are in place. This leads me to my constructive about the greater checks and balances of a coalition government. If there are multiple parties involved, there'll be more ideologies taken into consideration, and this will ensure that there's no party that is, so to say, ruling the rest, ruling the rest of the parties or the citizens. And this leads to the lesser chances of an authoritarian government, because parties work as equals in a coalition government, like mentioned in the characterization as well. Now, since both parties are working as equals, there's no party that's overruling the others, and hence they can't make decisions for them or just overrule them. And so there are lesser chances of authoritarian government or a dictatorship. There'll be no fight between a democracy and a dictatorship, as the latter is simply not possible as established before. Now I'll be moving on to my second constructive, which is about upholding of democracy. Since I've already established that a democracy is the only feasible and only successful ideology that will work in a coalition government, I will be elaborating on this further with a different perspective. Since there are many ideologies that are involved in a coalition government, there'll be not one specific strategy that will rule the citizens, thus preventing an authoritarian government. To add on to this, I'll be merging the rebuttal with this as well. It was mentioned by the Prime Minister, that a coalition government doesn't consider what people want. But what we're trying to say is that a coalition government still requires a majority vote. It's just that the 2 parties are merging together, and then again, these voters are voting for the party which they think is more suitable. Now, these increase the chances of the parties getting voted, but that's I'll be taking this later. This still doesn't mean that these parties, that the citizens' wishes are not being taken into consideration. Democracy still exists in this scenario as well. It was also mentioned that the ideology doesn't get represented. Whereas ideology in a coalition government, the ideology gets improved because there's so many perspectives building onto each other, like mentioned several times before. due to the sharing of perspective. And so there's no manipulation of ideologies. Instead, they're just building it on to make it better for the citizens. I'll be taking that POI now.
Why doesn't side opposition, it is necessary that these parties would be able to coordinate with their absolute ideologies without some points of their very manifesto being disregarded, just so that they can be a presence in this coalition in the very first place?
You got the POI. We're not saying that the ideology will be taken it to the extreme. The basic structure of the ideology, the basic idea will still remain in place. The entire fact that you're working as a coalition government means that your ideologies are in some ways meeting. Okay, it doesn't mean that you have two very separate ideologies and so you completely start working together. There will be some similar points as well, which is what you will build upon, what you will propose to the citizens. And so there's no manipulation of the ideology shared to citizens. And so the democracy still exists. There's no manipulation, and there's much better proposing of ideas. And so I'm very proud to oppose. Thank you.
With this, I want to welcome the second speaker of opposition. Please take the stage.
Can I have 30 seconds to set up my timer and come up with rebuttals?
Of course.
Okay, so it is set up my timer. Yeah, so my time starts in 3, 2, 1. In a coalition government, you have two or more different parties with conflicting ideologies. I think that is something we need to all accept, because when you have these two different conflicting ideologies, you have two or more different sides that will eventually go against each other. This is what coalition governments entail, and this is why our side is proud to propose a motion. Okay, now so let's go through opposition's characterization. They talk about how a coalition is a type of government that's formed when two or more parties come together and share their ideas. It's kind of like a platform where these parties can openly share their ideas and their ideologies get merged. Here's the problem with this, because number one, both ideologies are not always merged. Coalitions are formed when you have when you have both major parties and minor parties. Especially in countries like India, these minor parties are considered lower to the main party. They're considered junior. They're considered junior parts of the government. They're considered small parties who, even though make up a huge part of their vote, and who, I'll take that later, and who actually make up a huge part of the voting system, but who also have pretty good ideologies, are mixed in with these big governments, and these big parties use the smaller parties as leverage. They use these smaller parties while not actually taking in their opinion, because to these bigger parties, these small parties are junior parties. It's something we've seen in Europe a lot, where the European Assembly and elections are held, and these junior parties, even after moving out of the coalition, get even lesser votes. Okay, I'll take it now.
Would you see a party with radically different ideologies, let's say BJP and Congress, ever forming a coalition?
Could you repeat?
Would you ever see two parties with radically different ideologies, for example, BJP and Congress, ever forming a coalition?
As you yourself said in your speech, it is mainly based on votes. It isn't really based on ideology per se. It is mainly based on votes. They might come, so it's not really ideology based, but ideology does make up a part of the actual decision-making process. At the end of the day, as you said, the goal of as the opposition speaker said, the goal of every government is to get more votes, to come into power, and then to help the people out in the country. Okay, so now that we've shown you how their idea of the characterization here is skewed, let's go on to their stakeholder analysis. They talk about how these political parties have better plans, more perspectives, less loopholes. But as we've shown you, these more perspectives do not necessarily mean that these new perspectives will actually come in and form a new ideology or a new opinion. As we've shown you, there are junior coalitions, there
POI.
are major. I'll take that later. There are junior coalitions, there are major coalitions, and so if parties value other parties as less equal, and we've given you examples for that. And because of this kind of intermixing and correlation does not work. While we show you on our side, without the existence of coalition parties, you have all of the other parties going in the opposition of this main government, and because of that, there's a much bigger forum. Both parties are considered equal here because again they are opposing, there's one opposing side and there's one side going for, and because of this you have a bigger forum for discussion and overall more participation by the smaller parties and more participation towards the betterment of the people. Okay, so now let's look at the constructives.
POI.
They talk uh, I'll take it later. So they talked about how more ideologies are taken into picture, something a point we have already rebutted. So they talked about how many ideologies are involved and how there's no specific strategy for ruling the people. And this is where we flip this point and say, when there's no specific strategy ruling the people, how are the people supposed to know which policy to follow? Because when there are a mix of different policies, it just creates additional confusion for the person. When there is one government with a lot of different people coming in together, giving their opinions, because political parties have a lot of different wings, and because of these different wings, one political party itself can come together and form a good opinion. And again, as we said, we have an opposition side, so because of this we have more of a forum for discussion. When you have one singular policy as opposed to many different policies,
POI.
when you have many people following one singular policy, which helps the country out a lot, because instead of having the confusion of saying, oh, there are 5 different policies, which one do I follow, how do I work this out, you have one policy, one a fully formulated policy, one which people can follow easily. Yes, I'll take that POI now.
Regional representation allows these regional parties to be represented at national level, which gives them more autonomy. So why is that particularly bad then for regional representation at national level to happen?
Okay, so look, as we've explained to you, these bigger parties view these smaller parties as junior parts of their coalition, and because of that, they don't really take their opinions. And once you have these junior parties breaking out of the coalition, their vote rates drop significantly and their voices are not heard. As opposed to when you have these two parties against each other, you have see the bigger party gets voted in, the smaller party is still there in the opposition and is able to easily go up to the government and say, hey, we don't really like this idea because number one, it does not help the people. And then the opposition can educate the government on how to improve the plan, because that is how democracy works. Democracy is a panel, it's for the people, by the people, of the people. When you have two opposing sides like the opposition and government, as we've talked about time and time again, you have more forum for discussion. And because of this, we show you that our side has a better idea of this democracy than team opposition in this debate. Okay, so they talked about how better ideologies because of most perspectives, but then we show you how in coalitions, bigger parties view other parties' perspectives as bad or smaller, inferior to theirs. So through this, I hope we have convinced you that team proposition is in the right, and we hope that and we urge a pro ballot.
I thank the DPM for that fine speech. Now moving on to the third or second speaker of the opposition. Please take the stage.
Just gonna take 2 seconds.
Yes.
Okay, so I'll begin my speech. Just a second. I'll begin my speech in 3, 2, 1. I wouldn't let proposition get away with their claim that now in their side of the world they'll have most vote and make that party the ruler, considering that because it is very unlikely in a democracy to actually get the majority. So they'll allow the party with most votes to actually make up the government, which I wouldn't let proposition get away with their claims of democracy, because that is highly undemocratic, right? Because that doesn't show what people want, which is the basis of democracy. In a democracy, what we want is a majority of people to agree and and come to a consensus on who they are electing. So essentially coming and telling us that the party with the most votes would ultimately form the government is highly undemocratic on their side of the world, because it just gives the people a lack of choice. But also, this is what I'll be doing in my speech. Firstly, I'll be rebutting their two major claims about, firstly, ideology clash, and secondly, about regional representation being bad, which is the larvae of my substantive as well. And then I'll be rebuilding upon our points of checks and balances, and also holding up democracy, right? So, firstly, that point about ideology clash. What is ideology clash, right? And suppressing different ideology. What is very important to note is coalition is based on common ground. As they have already conceded in a POI, you'll never see like different parties with radically different ideologies forming a coalition like BJP and Congress. Right? Coalition is always formed between parties that have some common ideologies, and they work together to actually achieve a particular consensus or line that they could follow and base the government on, right? So when they answered the POI by saying ideology doesn't matter, that's highly untrue. Even when Congress and BJP don't get enough vote, they'll never go to each other to form the government. That's highly unlikely. And also, secondly, they talked about how people don't really know what's happening, and that is why it takes their like right away. But also, usually parties that form a coalition have a front during the elections themselves, like the left front or the NDA. They had the front before, so people already know that if for example a particular party didn't get the majority wins, who will they be forming the coalition with, and what their ideology and the basis of it is. So citizens already know, and citizens already know, right? So their point about ideology clash doesn't really stand. Now, what do they come up secondly tell us? What do they secondly tell us? They tell us about regional representation is bad. The larvae of this point is directly clashing with my substantive, which I'll be dealing with. But they talked about domination. But they talked about dominating, right? That these national parties would be dominating regional parties, and their voices wouldn't be heard, which is extremely unlikely, because in a coalition, as we've already talked about in our checks and balances point, you have a party depends on other parties, right? It's a coalition in which your government is formed, in which your entire government is formed on the basis that all of these parties are going to support you, right? The moment any of these parties withdraw, your entire government falls. So it's highly unlikely that these national parties wouldn't hear or suppress their ideologies, because they know that it would lead them to have backlash on them as well. Right now, what do you and also let's do a cost versus harm here. So what is the benefit versus harm analysis here? What are the benefits that you get then on our side of the world? Firstly, we increase checks and balances. How do we do that? So for the moment that you don't really have a single party, but you have a group of parties at the state level, so the parties have to cater to each other's needs, right? They all need to make sure that all of the other parties are satisfied in this coalition in order to maintain the coalition, because the moment any of these parties withdraw, the coalition falls, right? So they have to make sure that all of them are actually happy in this coalition. So they maintain a check and balance on each other, and this increases the chance of a single party being authoritative and undemocratic here. So and secondly, what we also ensure is that democracy, right? Because the moment you start taking most votes as a basis, it is highly undemocratic, because the majority of people in your country haven't consented to that party, and still that party has made it to the top, which is very unlikely to happen in a democracy. So we uphold democracy because we allow coalition to happen, which already people most likely know about in ideology, in order to form. And also, and that is why we're way better off. And the harms that might that, let's say, even in their best case, the few harms that we get
Sure.
of an ideology being suppressed is already is already not compatible. Right now, the major point about regional autonomy and regional parties being harmed, I'll be dealing with it through my constructive. So, what is the problem then in their side of the world? It is important to note that, especially a country like India, center has way more power than state governments, right? In its essence, let's assume that the center is one party and all the state governments are different regional parties. So a lot of state governments have regional parties, right? These regional parties don't get enough autonomy or funding by the center, where there is a different party, because center gives the fundings to these states, right? So these regional parties do not get fundings from center, and center has way more power in our democracy, and they choose to give greater funding to states that have their own parties, right? That have national parties constituting in them, and regional parties suffer because of this lack of funding and lack of support that they get from the center. The impact that it does has is because of the regional parties aren't able to bring about more development in terms of infrastructure, police, farming practices, etc. And ultimately, they're not able to bring about development in the state, which ultimately leads to the people voting them less and less, which ultimately leads to these regional parties being suppressed and national parties taking over, which ultimately leads to one party system, which ultimately is really, really bad. So, how do we solve this then on our side of the world? Now, due to these coalitions, as we've already told you in our checks and balances point, that now when these national parties are highly likely to bring up to make coalition with regional parties that have similar ideology as theirs, and when they do that, they have to respect these regional parties, right? They have to make sure that these regional parties in the coalition are happy, and they're more likely to hear to them, and there's going to be greater power sharing and accountability on their side, and there's going to be greater acknowledgement. And also, secondly, even more importantly, these regional parties will have a chance to get represented at a national level, and because regional parties are very local, right? They come from different backgrounds, from southern background, northeastern background. So all of these backgrounds being represented in our diversity being represented at a national level is a huge success. And all of these viewpoints from different parts of the world, which probably wouldn't be heard by national parties alone, are being represented at a national level, which is a huge win-win. Now, when there's greater technology autonomy for a party is being represented, now they're more likely to get respect, funding, autonomy, um, and because obviously they want to remain in the coalition. And there's this new culture of power sharing, and also very importantly noting that the national parties that form coalition, the parties have some sort of matching ideology. So ideology, the point about ideology clash simply doesn't stand, and that is why on both points of the harms and benefits comparative, we give you checks and balances to maintain there is no authoritarian government. We give you greater democracy. They come here and give us they come here to talk about ideology that I've already talked about is already common and then people know about it. They talked about a regional thing being suppressed, but we told you how rather on our side of the world they're glorified, and that is why we're very proud to oppose.
I thank the DLO for that fine speech. Now I'll be taking some time to evaluate the results. Thank you.
All right, thank you everyone. But before we move forward,